This is a video lecture for environmental science. Um, this was to replace the lecture that's either Friday, March 2nd or Monday, March 5th. Um, and we were talking about genetically modified organisms. So we talked about some of the mishaps and near misses on genetically modified organisms. Um, one of the things that is a hot button issue, as you recall from my last lecture, I talked about Bt toxin. Bt toxin is used in a lot of genetically modified plants in the United States. It is a toxin that's a pesticide, and each cell of each plant makes this pesticide. And when the pests go to eat the plant, then they encounter the pesticides and they go away, or they die. But it turns out that Monsanto, the company that markets Bt toxin, genetically modified plants, said that this would never make it into the human circulatory system. Okay. And there was a study that was done in 2011 by Eris et al., where Bt toxin was found in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women that they tested that were exposed to genetically modified corn, and 80% of the cord blood of the women who were pregnant women who were exposed to genetically modified corn. So presumably the Bt toxin was making it to the developing child. This was directly counter to what Monsanto had said. Industry had claimed that the toxin would be destroyed in the gut and it would never make it into the bloodstream. And they claimed this at the same time that the paper came out. So obviously, this is highly controversial. Um, and the controversy continues regarding genetically modified crops. And you have to ask, how did the toxin get there? Um, when you consume the plants, you are consuming Bt, low-level Bt toxin. There's no way to get it out of the plants once it's genetically modified. So that is presumably in your bloodstream if you consume genetically modified crops that contain Bt toxin, not only corn, but also soybean, wheat, potatoes, and other plants. The other thing, we talked about horizontal gene transfer just very briefly on Wednesday of last week, and it turns out that the DNA that's responsible for making the Bt toxin can hop from the genetically modified corn into some of the microorganisms that just normally are in your gut, in your intestines, like E. coli. So it's interesting to note that the DNA, DNA is rather fluid. It can go between organisms rather easily. This process is called transformation. And so scientists decided to test when you consume genetically modified plants, could it possibly hop to your gut flora? So in these tests, there was a small scale test to see if it would go from plant to bacteria. These are the genes. Pontaroli in 2009 affirmed that yes, it could go to bacteria, but we have to look at an earlier test by Deminesh in 2008 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, said that it couldn't. Okay, did a test and showed that it didn't indeed go to gut bacteria. But you have to look at conflicts of interest. In every study, there are, inherent conflicts of interest, the authors of the study. And it turns out that the principal investigator, that's PI, was a gentleman by the name of Simonette, and he was co-founder of a biotech company, Librogen. And he had a vested interest in proving that it didn't hop to gut bacteria. Okay. But earlier research showed definitively that yes, it would hop to gut bacteria. This was Netherwood in 2004 in Nature Biotechnology. And Netherwood and his authors tested 7 ileostomists. Okay, and ileostomists are individuals that have a problem with their colon, and so their ileum goes to a stoma, which is attached to a bag, and they actually poop from their ileum into the bag. And these ileostomists were studied. The reason why they were studied is because it's easier to get to their gut bacteria. A lot of gut bacteria don't survive going through the colon and then pooping out in a normal fashion. So they tested these ileostomists because they could get to their ileum very easily. And it turns out that before they even conducted the experiment, 3 of the 7 ileostomists showed evidence of low frequency gene transfer from genetically modified soybeans into their gut bacteria. So their gut bacteria had already been transformed. It was, I'm not sure if they were expressing the Bt toxin, but this was actually before they were going to consume genetically modified soybean and they were disqualified for the test. Um, but evidently, over a lifetime of eating genetically modified soybeans, which you get from a lot of foods, these individuals were found to have transformation, and their gut flora were presumably producing proteins like Bt toxin that could only come from genetically modified plants. So that's a big concern. One of the things that you can do if you are concerned about this and are concerned about your gut flora being tainted with foreign genes is to consume a good probiotic. If you take a daily probiotic, then you're replenishing your gut bacteria on a regular basis. And if you have any genetically modified gut bacteria, then you're flushing it out. Okay, so so we're going to transition a little bit. We talked about genetically modified crops, and we'll talk about it later in the chapter as well. But I want to go back to what we eat. And it turns out that we have a very limited diet. We only consume about 12 different grasses or grains, 3 different root crops, things like potatoes and yams, 20 or so fruits and vegetables, 6 mammals, 2 domestic fowl, chicken and turkey, and just a few fish species. So we have a very limited diet. Okay. And corn and soybean are the major crops in the United States. Corn is used primarily for a sweetener for high fructose corn syrup that's used in a lot of like soda pop. And soybean is used as a protein additive. And between corn and soybean, this makes up about 85% of all the commodity crops in the United States. So it's a big slice. And if you look at how these have grown, you can see that there's steady growth, especially with corn. There's a saying in agriculture for the United States, corn is king, and it really is, because we produce more corn than anything else. Soybeans and wheat are a distant second and third. Okay. And we eat a lot of meat, and meat consumption follows the increase in corn and soy production. It turns out that a lot of animals eat corn feed, eat soy protein, and so when you see those 2 commodity crops go up, then you'll see a lot more livestock production. And meat consumption is now about 26 kilograms per person per year worldwide, which is a huge increase. More and more people are eating meat. And meat and dairy products give important nutrition, protein, iron, fats, and other nutrients. And it's also a sign of wealth. It takes a lot of money to produce um, things that are higher in the trophic pyramid. Okay. And in the United States, we have a lot of confined animal feeding operations. We look at chickens in cages, beef that are in feeding yards, things like that. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of land, but the land is overused. Okay. And we also have done things for enhancing the growth by using different hormones, which I take pause at. I think it's a little difficult to get these hormone residues in your meat and then consume them. We don't know what that's going to do to the human population because the hormone residues are just automatically in the meat. And because of these hormones, we're now seeing cows mature after just 18 months, which is about double or half the time that it takes for a bull to mature. Chicks are harvested for nuggets after just 8 weeks. I mean, that's preposterous. So these growth enhancers are really, really speeding up growth. They do make things more efficient, but we have to look at what are they doing to the animals themselves and what are they doing to the humans that are consuming the animals. Okay, and if we look at um, for 1 kilogram of bread, how much um, how much grain is consumed. That's 1 kilogram. For 1 kilogram of fish, that's 1.5 kilograms of grain. 1 kilogram of chicken, 2 kilograms of grain. 1 kilogram of pigs, 3 kilograms of grain, and then 1 kilogram of cattle consumes 8 kilograms of grain. So they're the most expensive to produce, and that's why beef is very expensive meat. Okay, here's confined livestock. They're very, very crowded conditions in a cattle feedlot. And you can see that it doesn't take up a whole lot of land, but the land is going to be overused. Same thing for chickens. This is what you would consider cage-free. It's not a free-range chicken, but it's a cage-free chicken. Still very, very crowded conditions as they're being fed and they're pooping all over the place. And so it's not a very, very pleasant place. But when you get cage-free, don't be deceived. Cage-free still is a factory farm, and it looks something like this. Okay. Uh, Worldwide, there's a lot of seafood consumption as well. And about 15% of all the animal protein or the meat. And there's been a lot of overfishing. Fishing is a tough one because a lot of times this is in international waters and it's very, very difficult to come up with a law, international law, to prevent overfishing. Countries have to sign on to treaties, and a lot of times the treaties are violated. And fishing methods and the magnitude of fishing are to blame for overfishing. There's large drag nets that scoop the bottom and destroy the entire ecosystem. We talked about that before. And as much as 15% is just bycatch, things like dolphins that are dead and they are basically discarded. Okay. And restoration of these fisheries is based on treaty creation and treaty enforcement, which is very tough. Like I said, to get countries moving together is a very, very difficult thing. And even when they do move together for restoration, then there's treaty enforcement and there's a lot of poaching. And these are open waters, and so it's very, very difficult for an enforcement officer to see what's going on. A lot of fish come from aquaculture, fish farms, and fish farms are kind of gross. Hate to sound like Debbie Downer, but farm fish are in a confined area. There's a lot of fecal material, and a lot of times what they eat will be contaminated or they'll be contaminated in the environment. Some fish farms are in abandoned coal mines. And this also can lead to depletion of wild fish stocks. You have fish that we eat like salmon are carnivores. And so rather than having wild fish for the salmon to eat, they're being used for fish farms. And so they're overfishing for the bait for the fish farms, and that depletes the environment of these important fish that are involved in the food chain. Um, and some fish farms have displaced mangrove forests and wetlands. In the tropics, they release fish feces, uneaten food, antibiotics that are used a lot of times in aquaculture. You have to use antibiotics because disease spread is rampant in these fish farms. And so a lot of these will end up ultimately in the environment. Okay, and here's farmed fish. They're just out in the open and there are pens. And so there's nothing that is preventing the spread of, things like feces or antibiotics or uneaten food to go into the remaining environment. Okay, and there's a lot of biohazards from industrial food production. Animals poop. They make lots of poop. So there's manure from feedlots, liquid waste associated with fish farms and lagoons, airborne fecal dust that gets into the surrounding environments. Airborne fecal dust can contain a lot of viral diseases. Lots of antibiotics. Antibiotics are used routinely in animal meat just to prevent disease spread among the animals, especially in close quarters. You would figure that disease spread would be a big problem, and so they use a lot of antibiotics. And the more antibiotics that you use, the more this affects the bacteria, and natural selection by these antibiotics then raises up bacteria that are resistant to a multiplicity of antibiotics, and these bacterial infections can cause disease in humans. Okay, once they cause disease in humans, they're antibiotic resistant and they're very difficult to treat. Okay, and using these factory farms and these farmed fish and antibiotics, it produces really cheap food. And so traditional methods are more expensive, and therefore these farms are difficult to displace. It's difficult to, wind back time and go back to cattle grazing that is less crowded in, instead of feedlots, because we're an economy that is based on this very, very cheap food. Okay. And the improved efficiency has a high environmental cost. It's destroying the environment because of release of manure, release of toxins, and there's a huge human health cost associated with it as well, especially when you look at the carryover of antibiotics in our food. Okay, so now we're going to switch a little bit here, go to a bit of a different domain. So I'm going to talk about soil. So we'll talk about the layers of soil, but soil is, if you look at the different types of soil, you have sand and gravel, silt, which is very, very fine particles, and clay. Dead organic material is always in soil. And then you have soil fauna and flora of animals and plants, okay, down to microorganisms, lots of water in soil, and there's entrained air, especially in topsoil. Okay, so here's some examples of some lush vegetation here in soil. These are terraced landscapes for growing, I believe, rice here. Okay, and here's some soil microorganisms. You can see some microbes, rods, and spherical microorganisms that are grown directly into the soil matrix. Okay, so if we look at healthy soil fauna, fauna are animals. This would be bacteria, algae, fungi, and they are the decomposers. And so things like leaf litter and fecal material that need to be broken down into nutrients that are accessible by plants, these fauna play a very strong role. Worms and nematodes produce organic material. The organic material is used by the soil bacteria. And worms and nematodes, as they're crawling around, they create air spaces so they aerate the soil. And disturbances, um, too soil fauna, too much rain is going to cause runoff, so the fauna runs off. Drought, not enough water, extreme heat or cold, and frequent disturbance like trampling are all things that can create problems with soil fauna. Okay, and so we're going to look at the different layers. I want you to know the layers. Um, the different layers are O for the organic layer, which is just above the topsoil. A, which is the next layer down, which is the topsoil. E, below the topsoil, is alluviated, and it's usually much more compact, like clay, and humic acid, which is an organic acid that goes down to the lower layers. And then B, which is the subsoil, that's the lowest layer. It has clay and other material leached from the upper layers. Okay, so you don't see humic acid in B, but you do see it in E. The majority of the organic material is in A, and then where you see leaves and litter and things in the process of decomposition is the top layer O. Okay, so O, A, E, and B. Know those different layers. Okay, and I do want to remark that these will be on test 3, but they will not be on test 2. Okay. Food mainly comes from the A horizon. This is what we would consider topsoil. It is where the organic material has been broken down to the place where plants can access it. So the root zone is primarily in the A zone. Okay, and the A horizon in soil that supports corn is pretty thick. It's 10 or it's about 6 feet, 2 meters thick. In desert ecosystems, you have almost no O or A soil. And mollisoils are a type of soil that has thick A layers and they're rich in organics. Alpha soils have a thinner A layer. These are definitions you should know. You find those in deciduous forests. And iridosoils have very little organic material in the desert. Okay, so mollisoils would be something like what you would grow for crops. You would want lots and lots of topsoil that is really rich in organics. Alpha soils, forests where the topsoil doesn't have to be as extensive, and iridosoils, what you would find in deserts. Okay, yeah, and here's a temperate grassland. Okay, grassland, you would see a lot more O and A, and then a desert and the Libyan Valley, just almost no O and A soils, just more E and B, lots of clay, lots of sand and silt, and that's really about it. Okay, now if we look at the croplands and where we find the cultivated croplands, it's where you would expect. The Midwest is the grain belt, extending all the way up to North Dakota and as far down as northern Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, especially around the Mississippi River. So we see a lot of crop cultivation in the middle, and then in the Great Plains, which are more arid, then almost no crop cultivation. These are used more for grasses and grazing. Okay. We look at different soil abuses as well. So again, looking at some of the soil abuses, and we'll cover this sort of as the last section of this lecture. Okay. First of all, there's erosion. Erosion happens when you have a lot of rain and or a lot of wind, and you start to lose the O and A layers of the soil. Desertification, when the climate changes, this is almost a disturbance, or is a disturbance, where the climate goes from a more of a moist to a dry environment. Development, development, a lot of these accessible lands are good land for development where you would see crops being formed, or you would see a more industrial or urban or suburban development. And if you look at over the last 50 years, worldwide, almost 4 billion acres have been degraded, with about 600 million strongly degraded. So, this type of soil abuse we need to look at. We need to look at the amount of available soil for croplands as well as for ecosystems that are providing services that we need. And the biggest players are water erosion and wind erosion. And this happens significantly, especially when the soil becomes poor quality and is easily eroded. So we'll talk about that. And here are some different types of erosion. This is when you just have a lot of runoff with a more of a topsoil that is very, very close to the surface. It's called sheet erosion. Gully erosion is when you have streams that form, and these streams then will fill with water when there is rain, and that causes runoff. And then wind erosion. Here you can see severe winds and have depleted this, and it caused desertification here and just a few grass stands here and there. Okay. So the different types of erosion, which you should know, are sheet erosion, which you lose a thin layer of soil due to water. Rill erosion, which are small channels on the way to forming gullies. Gully erosion is when the rills get bigger. And then stream bank erosion is around rivers and streams. And this is when the streams start to encroach on the soil, so you start to lose more and more soil to the stream bank. Wind, you find after desertification has occurred. So this is in dry regions where vegetation is sparse. You see this a lot in China as there are less and less protective flora to protect the soil against wind. Then the wind can erode the good soil, expose the more thin sandy soil, and that helps aid in desertification. When you think of row crops, this would be like corn, soybeans, even potatoes. This leaves a portion of the soil exposed for much of the growing season because in the middle of the rows is exposed soil, and so you can get a lot of wind erosion just by wind blowing through the crop itself and where the soil is exposed. Okay. Also have to look at agricultural inputs: water, fertilizer, oil, and pesticides. Okay, so when we look at water and fertilizer, we'll primarily look at water. And you'll see that water is a necessary thing. Even when it causes runoff and problems, it takes about 2/3 of all the fresh water use. It goes to agriculture. The rest goes to municipal water, things like that. So this isn't, it doesn't completely take the water away. It's just, this is based on the annual use of the water. About 2/3 of the use of the water goes to ag. Okay. And it turns out that 15% of all agriculture requires some type of irrigation. So it's not natural rainfall, which you would see a lot of corn crops in the Midwest, but a lot of ag is irrigation ag. So you see these large irrigation pipes that are, then you have, like center irrigation where the crop is being sprayed with water, or row irrigation where the crops are being watered directly on the ground. And so a lot of the ag does require irrigation. We see that a lot here in California because we have more of a dry environment. Okay, and when the soil is overwatered, it can actually become waterlogged. The soil is saturated with water, and that's a problem because a lot of the organisms in topsoil require oxygen. And so when you become waterlogged, that displaces the oxygen and the plant roots die. They need oxygen just as well as the aerial portions of the plant, and they will die off, causing the whole plant to die. Okay. Uh, Runoff can occur um, from adjacent soils, and causes salinization, where you get too many mineral salts, and that then becomes toxic to the plants. Okay. In terms of fertilizer, plants' primary needs, if you consider, the macromolecules that need these, like amino acids and nucleic acids, their primary needs are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you'll see that most uh, fertilizers are labeled NPK, N for nitrogen, P for phosphorus, and K for potassium. Um, and that just gives you the ratio of these different elements that are needed by the plants. And over-fertilizing is a common problem. It's easier to over-fertilize than it is to under-fertilize. If you under-fertilize, the plants will not grow. If you over-fertilize, that's fine. And if the left fertilizer then runs off and it seeps into the groundwater, which especially nitrogen and phosphorus can be a big problem. And this leads to nitrate poisoning in the water. And here's, a lot of fertilizer is used in the United States, but it is now becoming more predominant across the world, especially in the developing world. And this could expand to the developing world and lead to some of these problems. It's not necessarily that fertilizer use is bad, it's just that practices can be abused. Okay. The alternative is organic farming, where you get your nutrients from manure. This tends to not over fertilize because manure is pretty self-limiting in terms of the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that you would find. Oil and pesticides are also used in farming. Obviously, you don't directly apply oil to the ground, but you need gasoline and diesel in order to run your equipment. And so agriculture consumes about 16% of total energy use. And like I said, farm equipment relies on diesel and gasoline, and so you have emissions from that. And each hectare, remember hectare is about 2 acres, consumes about 5 barrels of oil. So, these are non-renewable resources, and we have to look at that in terms of their consumption. Processing and transportation, to get food to a processing plant and then ultimately transport it to the grocery store. Most food in the United States travels an average of 200 kilometers from farm to table. Okay. And then we need pesticides. We need some way to combat biological pests. Okay, I'm not saying that necessarily we need harsh chemicals, but pests do destroy crops, and they can reduce crop yields by 50%, which means less money for farmers, okay, and less food for consumers. So by rotating crops and small crop plots, then you can reduce the pest problem. Pests will settle in when you have a consistent crop over a period of time, so they know they have a consistent food source, and they also settle in larger crops. More crops means a greater cluster of insects. The insects colonize in larger clusters of crops, and so you can prevent this with smaller plots. The primary type of pesticide, this is an organophosphate. This would include glyphosate, which is a weed killer. Okay, glyphosate is Roundup, which we talked about before with genetically modified crops. There are also chlorinated hydrocarbons, which are toxic and will kill off pests like atrazine. This is used, I believe, for insect pests. And then fumigants like highly toxic gases are used. Sometimes heavy metals, and these are a little more difficult because they persist in the environment for a long, long period of time. They do not break down. Metals don't break down at all because they're an atom, and you don't break down an atom like you would an organic phosphate or a chlorinated hydrocarbon. And arsenic is a real problem in rice paddies and also in cotton production because traditionally they used a lot of arsenic pesticide for cotton production, and now these fields are not used quite as much for cotton, but they're used more for rice, and they're finding arsenic in the rice and the rice products that come from these fields. So it can be a big problem. And indiscriminate use of pesticides obviously is going to be a problem. They accumulate in a few chains, and when you get to the higher trophic levels, like the birds, bald eagles and DDT, which we talked about before, at the higher trophic levels, more pesticides will accumulate because of the bioaccumulation factors that once you go up in trophic level. Okay. Turns out that atrazine and glyphosate will cause developmental deformities in species in the water, frogs, salamanders, and fish. And glyphosate also causes a lot of problems in humans. Its use needs to be curtailed. They use an awful lot of glyphosate on GMO crops that resist glyphosate, Roundup Ready crops. And so these are really a big problem. These are poisons, and the poisons are persisting in the environment. And also, natural selection occurs. Nature will always find a way around these pesticides. And when you do a big experiment like this in natural selection, then you will raise up weeds and insect pests that ultimately are resistant to these pesticides. So these are super pests, and you have to find some way to combat them because they will look at atrazine and glyphosate like they're candy, and they'll be able to consume them without any harmful effects. Okay, this causes a pesticide treadmill because as soon as the insects and weeds become resistant to the first types of pesticides, then you have to create a new type. Then the same thing will happen. They'll become resistant. Then you create a new type. They become resistant to that. So you're basically always chasing your tail, and you'll always have to be developing new pesticides as pests become resistant to the old ones. You can use cover crops as alternative methods. These cover crops are planted at the periphery, and they will keep the insects out of the interior. You can use mechanical cultivation, planting many crops in a single space, polycultures. Insects don't like that. Insects like a steady diet, like all potatoes or all wheat or all corn. And then biological control agents like known predators that will eat the insects that that will feast on the insects, and that will keep the insects population down. Okay, and you look at the amount of atrazine that's been used, it's quite high. This is pounds per square mile. And if you look at the I states, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana especially, they're just covered with red here. There's lots of atrazine use. Atrazine is poison. It's a chlorinated organic, and it will persist in the environment. It does persist in humans as well. Okay, and here is a graph that shows the number of pesticide-resistant strains of pests, and it's really gone up starting in about 1975, and it continues to go up, and scientists have identified over 350 types of pests that are now resistant to pesticides. Okay, and that concludes our video. Let's see. It's a bit of a short video. I'm at about 40 minutes. This is all you need to watch. I want you to be able to watch this prior to our
review for our exam. We're going to review for exam 2 on March 7th, which is Wednesday, and then exam 2 will be given on March 9th, which is Friday. Okay, and I will see you next week.